In this Lords of the Fallen video, I'm going to be showing you my assassin build. This is an agility build that focuses on dual wielding daggers and stacking up status effects in order to obliterate enemies quickly. So the weapon that I'm using for this build is the Kin Ranger Hunter dagger. I have two of these, and what I really like about this dagger is it has okay agility scaling, but more importantly, it has Frostbite buildup. Frostbite is a status effect in this game that rips off a lot of posture on enemies when it triggers and deals a decent amount of damage, and on players, if you're PvPing, it reduces their stamina bar by half for its duration. And what's really good about that is that damage that pops off when this triggers, particularly against like trash enemies and, medium difficulty enemies, you're usually going to get like a nice burst of damage in the middle of your dagger combo that's going to finish them off or all but finish them off when you're fighting so that, they die faster. And the reason that I'm using these daggers instead of the daggers like the poison bowman daggers that deal poison buildup instead is that we're using the poison weapon spell here to buff our damage and to give us poison status effect buildup on our weapons when we attack. So we're getting the frostbite buildup and we're getting the poison buildup. So these enemies are taking damage. And one of the nice things I've noticed is it seems like frostbite damage is based on the total health of the enemy, and poison is as well. So the higher health pool that these enemies have, the more effective that these are going to be against them, which means that this doesn't like taper off in New Game Plus or something like that, or the further you go into the game, because it's based on the health of the enemies, or at least it is from my testing. So what you have here is a very rapid combo where you keep applying the poison status effect build up until it pops. Enemies are then poisoned over time. Keep applying frostbite until that pops. Enemies take damage that usually kills weak enemies, almost always, but all but kills medium enemies, and obviously takes a big chunk of health off hard to kill enemies. And then we're using the Bloodbane Ring here, which makes it so that when we inflict poison buildup, we also inflict bleed buildup. And what bleed does is it triggers a status on an enemy that where you hit them, they take, or whenever they take damage while they're bleeding, they're going to take extra damage. And this only happens for like a number of hits, but that's going to rip off a huge chunk of health at the same time just by what we're doing already. So what's going to happen is you're going to apply bleeding, poison, and frostbite to an enemy just by attacking with your buffed weapons, and that's going to rip off huge chunks of health in a hurry. And what I really like about the dagger moveset compared to something like short swords, which you could arguably make a similar build, with these type of weapons on, is that daggers consume far less stamina when attacking, and it allows you to keep chaining your attacks. And they actually reach a lot further than you would think. The character steps forward a very good distance when you're fighting with daggers, so it's not very difficult to close the gap with enemies when you're using daggers compared to maybe some other games. So in order to be able to use Poison Weapon, which is obtainable very early on in the game from Mulho and Skyward Bridge, you can buy it as soon as you get there. We'll obviously need an Umbral Catalyst. We're using the first one here, Charm of Fortune Sight. I've upgraded it simply because we sometimes use Umbral Orb as a ranged attack in pinches where we need to like take out a pesky ranged enemy. We don't use it very often, but having more damage with it is better than having less damage, so I've upgraded it a little bit here as well. And also I have Putrefaction here, which summons an AoE Poison Mist that can poison enemies over time. I don't use this all that often. It's obtainable not super far into the game in the Forsaken Fen area. But it's, you meet the requirements for it, so why not have it for those times where maybe you can like poison a bunch of enemies or get an enemy to sit in it while you're fighting them. And in order to be able to cast these spells and use the Umbral Catalyst, you'll need at least 12 Radiance and 12 Inferno. So that should be probably like the first thing that you're focused on when putting this build together. And you don't actually need that much to cast the spell itself, Poison Weapon, but you will to use the Catalyst, so you need that. And about 15 Radiance, 15 Inferno, you'll have 300 mana, which will allow you to cast Poison Weapon 5 times without having to, use a consumable or rest at a vestige. So that's kind of what I recommend aiming for at some point, is getting your Radiance and Inferno up to 15 each in order to be able to use that 5 times before having one of those. So for armor for this build, there's really two ways to go if you want to put this together. A lot of agility builds will want to use light armor and have like light encumbrance to be able to dodge better, etc. And you can absolutely go that way if you want. The other way is to stack as much armor as you can to stay just in the medium encumbrance threshold and have a decent amount of protection. We do tend to spam chains of attack with this build, and we're very, very hyper aggressive. Sometimes you will be chaining your attacks into an attack anyway, trying to finish an enemy off or trading damage. So I kind of like this way, but you can go the light route if you prefer. Now, if you're going the way that I did with this build and you're going like the medium encumbrance route with as much protection as you can stack and stay in that range, you're going to want to use the Pendant of Burden. What this is going to do is it's going to increase your damage for every status effect that you have inflicted upon an enemy. And since we're inflicting poison, bleed, Frostbite constantly, this is going to crank up your damage as more and more of these apply. And it's going to up your damage, particularly like in boss fights or something like that that last longer, or against difficult enemies where you really need that extra damage. So that's really great. The other option here is Princess's Sting, which rewards you for having lighter equip load and increases your damage all the time for just having lighter equip load. And I highly recommend using that one if you plan to kind of go like the lightest equip load you can, wearing some armor, using the daggers, etc. That way your damage is high all the time, but your protection is less. So it's kind of up to you. Do you want more damage in general, or do you want more protection? You can play either way, and your pendant will change depending on, what setup you have. And for rings, you want the Bloodbane ring, as I mentioned earlier. This allows you to inflict bleeding while you're doing poison, which is kind of part of this build, which is really, really strong. You want to get that one. That's located in Forsaken Fen, not too far into the game. Now, your third ring slot is really, you can put whatever you want there. I highly recommend putting something that increases damage, but a lot of those rings are found later into the game. I messed around with York's ring, which theoretically increases your Frostbite damage. So when your Frostbite triggers, it should boost the damage that Frostbite does, but in my testing, it actually reduces the damage, so I don't think that's working correctly. Although if that does get patched, it should boost this damage of this build significantly. Another good choice is Lucent's Sword Ring, boosting your damage when your health is high. Or you can use Melikor's Ring that just boosts your physical damage. Or even Grayson's Ring that makes it so that when you're dual wielding, you have increased damage. For runes on my weapons, I like to use Demexis. This makes it so that you have increased physical damage while dual wielding. Our weapons deal exclusively physical damage, and poison and frostbite are separate things than that. So this is really good for that. You can stack one in each dagger. And then also for the second rune, I like to use the one that increases your physical damage but reduces your strength scaling. We're not really focusing on strength with this build, so that's not really much of a downside. And then when you get your third rune slot, you can slot another Demexis there to further boost your damage while dual wielding, or any other rune that boosts your physical damage. So jumping into the attribute side, talk about starting class for this. The Exiled Stalker is probably a good start for this. You start with 2 daggers. It kind of gets you into the style of dual wielding. You'll need to increase your Radiance and Inferno early on in order to use Poison Weapon up to 12 each, which you can do right away. And then you can start Poisoning Weapon and kind of getting this. You won't have the Frostbite, but you probably won't need it early on. And then until you get these daggers that we're using. You can put this build together very early on in the game. Like the things needed is not, all the way to level 70, which is one of the things I really like. And it's been a theme that I've been trying to put together through my builds, that even though some of the things I'm using are later game, the general concept of the build can start really early on and it just gets stronger throughout the game. Now, attribute-wise, you're going to want a lot of vitality because you're playing very aggressively and you tend to get hit, particularly if you're going the light armor route and trying to be very light with your equip load. You definitely probably want even more vitality than we have here, just because you're going to take more damage when you get hit, so you need to live. You don't need a ton of endurance with this build. Endurance is, again, much better if you're going for the equip load route, the light equip load, because it increases your max equip load, which then ups your damage the lighter in your encumbrance you are. So endurance is better to have a lot more of if you're playing the light equip load, but if you're playing the way we are, you really don't need much endurance at all. Just a few points is plenty. Now, taking a look at agility, which is the primary scaling attribute for this build, if you'll look at the weapon, you'll see you're not getting a ton of damage out of it. You're getting like 48 damage from the scaling with 40 agility. That's not a lot. It's like 1.1 or something per point. That's not a lot at this point. Obviously, as we upgrade the dagger more and its scaling improves, that number will go up higher. But you really don't need a ton of agility early on in the game. You want to focus on getting your Radiance and Inferno in a good spot, getting your Vitality and Endurance where you want them, and then focusing on agility. It's not going to add too much damage to this build. So make sure to add it, as you go, but you don't want to just like crank up agility early on. And one other thing that I want to mention is you can play a similar build to this if you want and get rid of the, catalyst and use like poison salts to put extra poison build up on your weapons. And play that way if you'd prefer to free up your offhand for like a bow, or free up your range slot for, like thrown weapons or something like that. You can do that if you want. I just found that you're going to go through a lot of poison salts playing that way, particularly early on in the game, and you're not going to have a lot of vigor to spend on poison salts when you're trying to level up. Later on in the game, when you've already made a lot of levels, it's a lot easier to do. But if you don't want to form poison salts, then this is a much better way to do it. But if you want to like really min-max this build, probably using poison salts and having like a thrown option might be better. So that wraps up my assassin build. I hope you guys found that helpful. I think we're going to do like 1 or 2 more builds for this game. I don't think we have too many more builds coming. If there is a specific build you would like to see, please leave it in the comments.